Good morning, everyone. This is Joyelle Brandt here from Parenting with PTSD, and I am speaking today with Andrea Papin. And Andrea is a trauma-informed, attachment-based registered therapeutic counselor based in Vancouver, BC. She believes that our experiences profoundly shape our physiology and that our behavior and emotions are directly influenced by the state of our nervous system. If an individual does not feel safe in their bodies and environment, they are unable to experience the freedom that is necessary for growth, connection, and creativity. She is continually learning, growing, and healing. She uses her writing, dreams, relationships, imagination, instincts, and nature as a source of wisdom and inspiration. And you can find her at andreapapincounseling.com. And you can also find her on Instagram. She has a fantastic Instagram feed. Look up Andrea Papin Counseling on Instagram as well. And I've been following Andrea's writing for a while now. I love what she talks about in her writing. And there were a couple of posts that she had recently that really resonated with me. And also I'm finding this general conversation resonates with a lot of people, which is talking about the role of anger and grief and forgiveness in healing from childhood trauma. And one of the things that you said recently that I thought was really poignant was that anger and grief are partners in a wise dance. And I love that expression. Can you speak more to the relationship between anger and grief?
Well, I think they're very connected. Sorry, I can hear a little echo. We kind of can't really have one without the other in a way. When anger arises, it's usually about a boundary violation. There's some injustice that's taken place. And with that, inevitably comes grief as well. So there's this anger that arises, and that's kind of our body's way of telling us that we're experiencing, something that doesn't sit right with us. There's either a boundary violation, we're feeling like, okay, something's happening that doesn't feel good for me. And so anger is our body's way of telling us, stop, no, like I need to slow down, figure out what's happening. And then often as we kind of look at that anger and work through it and, figure out what is going on that's, bringing up this anger, we find that there's also a layer of grief there because there's usually loss that comes along with that, or we've been hurt in some way. So they kind of, and both of them are kind of taboo, actually. Like there's really not a lot of space in our culture to experience anger, especially as women. As soon as we start feeling angry about something, we're kind of told to calm down. It's usually not considered, it's not honored in the way that it should be, because I think it's very indicative of what's going on for us, and it should be honored. And then also there's a level of grief too that just isn't really culturally acceptable either. We're kind of told to get over things quickly. So I think it's about making space for both those emotions as healthy communications of what's going on for us.
Yeah, so I want to speak about both of those emotions. Anger. I can hear your daughter in the back. Is that your daughter in the background?
Yeah. Yes,
this is Life's Mommies. We do our work while our kids are around. I have the same situation happening a lot. So
I'm glad you understand. It's like
this is real life.
Yeah, this is real life, real mom life, parenting, and she. Okay, you can change in here. She wants to change her clothes in here, so
okay.
I'm gotta roll with it.
Yep, parenting.
Yep.
It's funny about that job. It doesn't stop like ever.
No, it really doesn't. I think that's like even to what we're speaking to. I think there's so much of that. Those emotions that can arise within the context of parenting too, and how taboo those emotions are for parents to feel. There's no space for that.
Yes, anger and grief come up huge for parents, survivor parents, and I mean all parents, of course, but survivor parents in particular. When you have children of your own, it brings up a mirror to show you just how young and innocent you were when you were abused.
Yes.
And there are layers of anger and grief that just erupt in the face of that understanding in a way that you never possibly could before you had children.
Exactly. Yeah, I think what you're saying is so true and important, that we suddenly have this connection to our childhood selves, a very visceral representation almost of what we were like at that age, and how huge our needs were. And I think, when we think back on our childhood selves, it's easy to feel this certain level of disconnection from that. But when we have this very alive representation, it's like, oh, wow, that, I was probably somewhat like that as well.
Right.
And that can bring up a lot of anger and grief around what you didn't get to have and what you deserve to have.
And the anger part, especially for women, is really challenging. I've been reading the book Rage Becomes Her right now, which is fantastic. Yes, I bet you would love it. It's an incredible analysis of how women's anger is at the same time, of course, brought up by patriarchy and suppressed by patriarchy, so that we go through our lives understanding very early on that anger is not something that we are allowed to feel.
Right.
And I'm sure you experience this too, because I know with the women that I work with, the moms that I work with, they will say, I don't know what to do with anger, because we have been culturally socialized to not express it at all. And there gets to be a certain point in a woman's life, midlife, where we go through this change and suddenly we cannot suppress the anger anymore.
Yes.
And do you find that this is something that a lot of people that you work with struggle with?
Yes, I think often, like, what I've noticed is that suppressed anger can often manifest as depression or anxiety. There's all this energy in the body that has nowhere to go, essentially. And, as we're kind of suppressing that, inevitably it's going to find a way to emerge. And that often kind of happens as anxiety. Or there's such a shutdown happening that we inevitably have to shut down everything. And then that manifests as depression.
And often,
there's just a wardrobe malfunction here that she's doing an excellent job of getting dressed, but alas, there was a slight malfunction. But I think, okay, you're perfect. You got it.
when
Team
my kids were that
Unicorn
little,
was
it was
upside
like
down.
constant costume changes all the time.
Yes, it's like bathing suit one moment, mermaid costume, tutu, all the different iterations of clothing that she has.
Of course. Then we get to be grown-ups and we only change when we work out. It's really kind of boring.
That's way less exciting.
It is. Touching in on the grief part, something I wrote about a little while ago is that there are certain forms of grief that are culturally acceptable. One I've really come to notice lately in the last few years is when someone's parent dies.
Right.
That for several years afterwards, there is a constant expressing of missing that person, the loss, the all of the feelings around that grief. And so people are very free to talk about that publicly. And also there's a lot of support, a lot of emotional support for people going through that. And for a lot of survivors of childhood abuse, we have essentially gone through what is the loss of a parent, but that grief is private and filled with shame and stigma, as if somehow we are responsible for that relationship not working out. And that's a different kind of grief that, again, becomes very present when you have children of your own, that grief comes up again.
Yeah, I think that is so profound, is that, we only kind of honor a very physical loss. It's like, if there's a loss that this person's totally gone, then we can acknowledge that to a certain degree. And even then, I think there are, strict parameters, but there's really no acknowledgement whatsoever in our society of developmental trauma. Because I think that actually it's very normalized. Like abusive childhoods are normalized, and that's almost considered like the standard of parenting in many ways. So yeah, there's really no acknowledgement of the grief that comes from being unseen and unheard in the context of your family of origin, and how vital that is, that feeling of belonging.
Yes, I think this mythology of the dysfunctional but truly loving family that we
Yes.
see in all of our Hollywood movies is incredibly, incredibly damaging. There is not any real acknowledgement a lot of the times about what you, like you were saying, the true damage of growing up in an abusive environment and how much that continues to impact you throughout your life.
Yeah, and I think too what you're saying is really relevant is that, in the context of those family systems, people feel like, oh well, my parents, like I know they loved me and they had good intentions. So as a result of that, I don't feel entitled to my grief. And so I talk a lot to clients about making space for those two things to coexist, that maybe your parents actually did have really good intentions and loved you the best way that they could, but that you were also really harmed in the process of that because they had their own limitations and you weren't able to be acknowledged in the way that you really needed to be.
Yes. And I think that leads nicely into the next topic that I wanted to touch on, which was this idea of how we think about our recovery journey. And you talked about the role of forgiveness and how that's
Mm,
portrayed. And I loved, there was one part that you said, all of these ways of talking about trauma seem to allude to a particular trajectory with an endpoint where we are healed, calm, and wise. And I see this over and over, even in the trauma literature that is scientifically based and understands the impact of adverse childhood experiences. They still use that sort of hero's journey, and then I discovered this kind of therapy and my life is
right.
wonderful and I'm healed now. And I love that you said, and I don't doubt that this is possible for some people, but I don't think that forgiveness is an endpoint, a necessity, or a feeling state that is static. And I think that that point is really important. This idea that like you were saying, we can hold two thoughts at once. We can have this compassion for what happened to us in one moment, and then the next moment be filled with rage. And those things
Yes.
are not like these dialectically opposed states of being. They can coexist, and that all of these things come up in the course of our healing journey.
Totally. And I think that is such a big piece of the healing journey is increasing our window of tolerance for uncomfortable states, emotions, sensations, and conflicting ones too. Because we have
Mm-hmm.
these parts to ourselves. We have this, maybe rational part that's jumping in and saying, it's normal for you to feel that way. And then maybe this other shame part that's coming in and saying, you shouldn't be feeling this way, and kind of allowing space for both those voices, and that they both are deserving of our compassion and of being seen and heard and understood.
Mm-hmm.
Because I
Mm-hmm.
think they're all serving some protective purpose, and those voices arise at different times in our life to kind of shield us or protect us, and are doing kind of the best job that they're able to do. And until we kind of make space for them, we can't really work with them.
And that for survivors who spent a lifetime being, most of us have kind of seesawed back and forth between a state of hyperarousal and a state of disassociation or numbing when it gets too much.
Yes.
When we become parents, we find that all of these strategies, all of these survival strategies that we had in place before having children no longer work for us because, first of all, we're constantly being triggered by our children. And secondly, there's no escaping it.
No, oh my God. It's just this constant bombardment. It's the hardest. I just don't think there's anything harder
Yeah.
than the intensity of parenthood. You're suddenly in this pressure cooker.
Yes. And a lot of the expectation of parents is that they are somehow going to be able to be the safe emotional buffer for their children. And this is an unrealistic expectation for people who can't even regulate their own emotions most of the time.
Yes, which makes it so challenging. And there's not a lot of support out there.
And there's not a lot of opportunity for honest conversation about it either, which makes it even
Yes.
harder.
Yes, there's so much shame and guilt and just not space to kind of be imperfect and struggling on our parenting journey. I think that's maybe changing a little bit, but not fast enough.
Yeah, I love that there's a bit of conversation happening now about ending the mommy wars and encouraging more compassion for each other in our journeys, and recognizing that we all have moments as parents where we lose it.
Yes. And I think the big question is how do we find ways for both children and parents to feel supported?
Exactly, that everybody should feel as safe as they can in the family.
Exactly. Yeah. And kind of, I think really working to get, like, having resources in our society for families, because there really aren't a lot of those, and trauma informed institutions that understand what's happening and can kind of really help support the family to increase their window of tolerance for big emotions. I think that's what it kind of comes down to in a way, is
Yeah.
being comfortable with these huge emotions that are going to arise in both parents and children and caregivers of any kind, whether it's, teachers or, like, because, that's happening in schools. And
Yeah, I see a lot of progress happening in the trauma informed movement in schools, and raising awareness about the need for emotional literacy, and for teaching kids about self-regulation. And I know both of my children were taught in kindergarten about learning to identify their emotions using the mood meter. They were taught about the role of the amygdala in shutting down the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus when you're under stress. And they were taught about different techniques that they can use to calm themselves when they're feeling triggered.
That's amazing.
By a situation. And it is amazing. And I think these are the things that we need to have happen for the whole family.
Yes.
We all need to have toolkits in place for emotional regulation. And most of us don't.
Yep. That's such a good point, is, providing access to those tools for everyone. Because the parents need that. I mean, as adults, we need that just as much as our children do. It's hard at any age.
It is. It is hard for everybody. And I think it's sometimes, working with trauma survivors, we judge ourselves so incredibly harshly because we understand the impact that bad parenting can have.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
Unfortunately, instead of just giving ourselves credit for the fact that we're probably doing better than what was done for us, often I see in the people that I work with just a layer of self-judgment that is so incredibly heavy every time they fall short of their expectations.
Yeah, it's really hard. And in a way, it's like so profound and beautiful that it's like they're wanting to give their child what their inner child didn't have. And I think that can actually be very healing work when there's, intentionality around it and compassion and space for that part that so desperately wants to be the parent that you didn't have.
Mm-hmm. And there's a dark underside to that I think a lot of people are afraid to voice, which is that you have moments where you are envious of your child when they are having the childhood that you wish that you'd had.
Yeah. There's so much grief.
Exactly.
And anger. Again, the anger and the grief.
And anger.
Yeah. And I think those are very valid responses to not experiencing what you deserve to have.
Mm-hmm.
And having an outlet for that, really, to be able to experience that so it doesn't, come out unintentionally in other ways where we feel maybe resentful or frustrated, rather than being able to channel those feelings, which, I think feeling what we feel is really just so important.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to feel that.
And you had mentioned in one of your articles about how men and women, their relationship to grief and anger is different, and that for women, it's harder for them to to tap into and feel anger. And for men, it's more of a challenge to feel grief, because of our social conditioning.
Yeah, I think it's, there are these kind of gender specific expectations and taboos, and there's just so many repercussions that come out of that, like the way we parent, our children, even the way we parent our girls versus our boys, and these, expectations that fit on the gender binary, and, they kind of keep us all very trapped.
Yes, on both sides, absolutely.
And how to, like, finding ways to break out of that, but it's, so hard because these societal norms are so powerful.
There's a lot of ideas that we get told about how we are supposed to heal. And I wanted to touch back into this idea of forgiveness again, because I think this is such an important point. I know we've seen lots of memes floating around Facebook lately about how we're supposed to forgive.
The kind of wellness culture, healing memes, I'm often like, oh.
Yeah.
Sometimes they do more harm than good.
Yeah.
They're very prescriptive.
Yes, it's interesting how the idea is that it's like this kind of one size fits all kind of healing for people. And although for some people forgiveness can probably be helpful, I've personally found in my healing journey that the whole idea it really makes me cringe. And I can have moments of compassion for the trauma that happened to the people who traumatized me. And in the next moment, I can have a moment of complete rage that arises in a moment when I'm triggered by something. And I don't think it's possible to just get to a magical point to say, oh, well, I've forgiven, but I'm done. Moving on. I mean, that's a nice idea, but
I'm on a personal level, I'm not familiar with that place. I think, for me, it's felt like a very cyclical journey. There's kind of a layer that you work through, but I find myself coming back to similar themes over and over again, but from a different place. And so there's a greater capacity each time. And I'm able to, feel things I couldn't feel before, or acknowledge things that couldn't be acknowledged before. But all those emotions are still arising, but in different ways each time. And I'm not even sure what forgiveness means. Like when you think about that word, what does that even really mean? What does that look like? I'm sure there's very unique expressions of forgiveness to each person that can look a different way. And it doesn't have to fit this very prescriptive expression.
Yes. I love you wrote, for years we may feel a sense of relief and of having moved on, and then suddenly another layer of our trauma is peeled back and we feel mired in darkness and uncertainty again. And I recently had a post. We have a PTSD parent survivor support group online. And we recently had a post, and the line at the end of the post just really slayed me, because she was struggling with a lot of triggers and things are rising up for her again. And it was kind of that point where she was feeling like, well, I thought I was through all this, and here it is all over again. And the last line was, when will I be healed?
Yeah.
And that kind of pain of feeling like you should be able to arrive at that destination and not get there is just piling suffering on top of suffering.
Totally. And I think it's scary when you have experienced some relief to suddenly feel like you're back in that place that is overwhelming. And I really try and remind other people and myself that you're never back to where you were before. It's never exactly the same. I think each time we come back to that place of struggle, we're more resourced, more resilient. And it's not the same, but it's still really challenging. It's just so hard to be in that place where we're really working with intense emotions that are arising.
Yeah. And the more we fight it, it's hard when we're in the low to remind ourselves that it won't always be like that.
Yeah. And I think that's where support comes in and is really helpful to feel like, like the community you're talking about. I'm sure it was really great for her to be able to post that and have other people kind of jump in and offer support and reminders that, what she's experiencing is really normal.
Hmm. In the end, I find that is the most powerful tool that we have, right? Is just to validate and normalize another person's experience and to let them know, like, you're not crazy, you're not irrevocably broken.
Yes.
This is just part of the journey, and it doesn't mean that it will always be like this, and it doesn't mean that there's something horribly wrong with you.
Completely. I think that's so important. And like I really believe that whatever is happening for people makes sense in the context of their lived experience.
Yes, exactly. And I think that that is the piece that we're really missing when we can't have open conversations about our trauma history. When we can have open conversations about this, then, oh, now we completely understand why you have this behavior, why you have this reaction to a circumstance.
Yeah.
And
Because
that's so powerful.
because any behavior is a coping mechanism. Any behavior is a strategy to get certain needs met, to cope with pain that's being experienced. And I think until, like, even within, the medical establishment or any practitioner, I think that when they're approaching those behaviors as just problems that need to be fixed rather than seeing them as, coping strategies that need to be honored,
Yes.
it leaves people feeling kind of shamed and less likely to share what's really going on for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not creating safety. And that's, I think, the most critical piece of the healing puzzle is safety.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is a perfect place to wrap up. Do you have any last thoughts that you wanted to share, Andrea?
No, I feel like we covered a lot of ground. It went so fast.
I know it did. I have been so looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much for being here and talking with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so honored. I feel so passionate about this topic. So I'm really happy to be here.
So you can find Andrea at andreapapincounseling.com. And if you're looking for me, you can find me at joyellebrandt.com. Andrea is a trauma-informed therapist, and I am a parenting coach for survivor moms and dads. And you can also find out about the book, Parenting with PTSD, at parentingwithptsd.com. Thanks, everyone, for being here today and for sharing your thoughts and comments. And I hope that you have a beautiful day. Please be kind to yourself. Bye, everybody.
Bye.